Hey, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this edition of the Mathewson-Plank Virtual Baseball Club meeting. And today we're going to be discussing this book, Pete Browning, well, the original Louisville Slugger, The Life and Times of Forgotten Baseball Legend Pete Browning. And we're lucky to have with us today Tim Newby, who is the author. Tim is a SABR member, and he's also an author of other books. His first two books were written about the bluegrass music industry, and he's contributed articles to a number of music publications. And it's my understanding that if you want to know anything about the music scene in Baltimore, Tim's your guy to go to.
That's a lot of pressure.
Tim also was a contributing writer to the SABR book, One Win Wonders, that Bill Nallon edited a year or two ago. He contributed an article about a Chicago White Sox pitcher. Maybe he'll touch on that today. That might interest RJ. And he was also a contributing editor to a book called The 1964 Buffalo Bills Profiles of the AFL Champions. But today, as I say, we're going to be discussing his book about Pete Browning. And this book was a finalist for the Casey Award, which is given out by Spitball, the literary baseball magazine, for the best baseball book of the year. And I believe it's also a finalist for the 2025 Forward uh,
Yeah,
Indies Book of the Year. Is that correct, Tim?
it is. Yeah, it's for like indie publishers, so academic presses, and kind of not the big traditional ones. So it's for the smaller indie presses that are out there, and it encompasses a lot of the academic presses. Um,
Excellent.
the book came
Well,
out through University Press of Kentucky. So
welcome, Tim. We appreciate you joining us today.
thanks for having me. It's always
Uh,
fun to come
no
talk
problem.
baseball.
Thoroughly enjoyed the book. I mean, a good read. So many times I mentioned this on these calls that books get nominated, and some of them are books that you would go by on the bookshelf and you wouldn't really give them a second look. But it's the old thing: don't judge a book by its cover, because this was really a good book. And I just wanted to ask you uh, about how the book came about. And as I was reading it, and I got back to the acknowledgments in the back of the book. You mentioned the idea came from your wife while you were having a few beers at the Bluegrass
Decisions are
Brewing
always made.
Company after touring the Slugger Museum. So I guess my question would be right off the bat was why Pete Browning and why the American Association?
And it's funny because you mentioned music, because everybody's like, well, how do you make that leap from writing so much about music? And I obviously have written about baseball and football and sports, but how do you make that connection? So the story of how I kind of came to write about Pete was my wife and I were in Louisville, just doing the touristy thing. We were at the Slugger Museum. We did the Muhammad Ali Museum, which is amazing if anybody hasn't done that. And I was vaguely familiar with Pete Browning, as I think, a lot of, people who maybe are a little more into baseball are. We're all familiar with Louisville Slugger, but we don't always know the man behind it. And on the tour, they're telling some stories and, some of the legends of Pete. And my wife, who also was the inspiration for my first book, Bluegrass in Baltimore, kind of nudges me and was like, this guy's super interesting. And I was like, it is. And I had just finished my second book, Leftover Salmon, 30 Years of Festival. And I was kind of casting out for some other ideas. And that night we're sitting at dinner and we were just having some beers and we were just kind of looking stuff up about this guy. Again, vaguely familiar with it, but didn't quite know everything. And a couple of things kind of struck me right away. One, I was like, why is there not a lot about this guy? He seems really interesting and kind of really important, but there's not a lot there. So I kind of said, well, I'm going to take the rest of the summer and just start researching. Maybe his story only is this big. Maybe that's all there is. And there's a reason for it, right? His story is just this one moment. Well, one of the things I came to find out is, one, besides him being this super interesting guy, is he really speaks to what I like to write about. And again, you're probably thinking, how do you connect music to him? Well, I like to write about things that are often overlooked, under-recognized, but yet have this really lasting impact. So Bluegrass in Baltimore, that the history of it there, this band Leftover Salmon, who was this legendary kind of progressive bluegrass band. So Pete fits into this mold. He's a really important figure in the 19th century, but most people don't really know much about him. So that's what really struck me about him, was this story. And And then as I kind of went in, I realized there was kind of three aspects to this story. There's the story of 19th century baseball, which, even for diehard baseball fans is sometimes a black hole of stuff. It's, we don't really understand it. It's when baseball's becoming baseball. It's when it's trying to figure out what it's going to be. They're figuring out we need to have a pitching mound, or we need to have, this many balls and this many strikes. And so I love that he's there through this evolution of the game. And then, there's the story of his life, which in itself is just super interesting. He has all these weird quirks, and he was eccentric, and at the same time he's got this amazing career where he's winning 3 batting titles in 2 leagues. And then there's kind of the legend of Pete. So all of those things were kind of what really drove me to this story of him. And the more I dug into it, the more I kind of found little nooks and crannies to like tell stories about and connections that he had. So that was really the kind of the impetus for the book right there.
Excellent. Well, we have Mark up here. He's listed as Scott, but Mark is a member of the Vintage Baseball Association, and he plays for a team out of Harrisburg. Mark, I think they play by the 1864 rules.
Yep.
And so Mark is, I'm sure, has an interest in baseball in the 1800s. But so why don't you, oh, excuse me, Tim, why don't you take us back to the 1800s and tell us about Pete the ball player and Pete the man, and
Yeah.
bring us up to
One of
date.
the things I like to ask is, and we don't have to raise our hands here and that, but like kind of ask yourself, like, how many of you know of Pete Browning? And I would bet a lot of people here know of Pete, but then ask yourself, what do you know of Pete? And I think that becomes a lot smaller. And often it's going to be just dictated by, one, his association with Louisville Slugger, and then two, just some of those kind of legends and myths of who Pete is. So Pete himself, and if you don't mind, if I can kind of read something out of here,
Sure.
kind of introduce it. If you're following along at home, I am going to read from page 2. If you don't have a copy, you can pick it up anywhere. So professional baseball and the history, myth, and legend that pervade it are often guided by statistics. We measure the greatness of players by those numbers. We understand the game through those numbers. We argue with friends and fellow fans about those numbers. Numbers tell us the story of the game and can shine a light on unknown or underappreciated players. For example, in the 150-year history of Major League Baseball, just over 20,000 players have appeared in at least one game. Among those players, only 27 have won 3 or more batting titles. Only 20 have hit 400 or better in a season. Only 5 rookies have won batting titles. Only 4 players have won batting titles in multiple leagues, and only 1 player has done all of that. And it's not who you'd expect. It's not Babe Ruth or Willie Mays or Lou Gehrig or Hank Aaron or any of the other legends of the game. It is Pete Browning, a powerhouse hitter from the 19th century who laid waste to many pitchers, but whose name is not familiar. In addition to his on-field accomplishment, Pete is recognized as not only the namesake, but also the genesis of the famed Louisville Slugger. He owned the first custom-made bat turned out by what became the Hillich and Brasby Company, sparking a revolution in the design and production of baseball bats. Pete was also a hitter of generational talent. His skills with the bat made the difficult art of hitting a baseball appear easy. But his numbers only tell half the story. Pete was larger than life. He was known as the Gladiator, Line him out Pete, the old warhorse. He of the red eye, the Prince of Bourbon, and early his career, simply Long Pete Browning. He was loud, boisterous, cocky, and lived his life to the extreme. So that's a quick overlook of Pete, but I think those numbers are kind of important. Pete himself, he was born in 1861 in Louisville. He lived in the west end of the city. He was from a fairly wealthy family. His father died in a tornado when he was 13, but it doesn't seem that Pete's life changed a whole lot. But Pete's life, really the thing that's going to come to impact him the most and impact his career, and to me really dictates who he is he developed an ear infection when he was younger. He developed mastoiditis. And nowadays, it's just not that big a deal. We have antibiotics and we can take care of that kind of stuff. But at the time, they didn't have that. And it was a pretty life-threatening situation for kids of that era. Pete survived through it, but the impacts and what lasted from it is really going to come to impact and dictate who he's going to become. So it's going to kind of basically start robbing him of his hearing. By the time he's a teenager, he's mostly deaf. It doesn't seem he was ever completely deaf, as there seems to be some level that he could hear, but mostly deaf, which is going to impact a lot of who he's going to become. It caused him severe pain. He had headaches regularly, vertigo. He talked of swelling in his eyes and swelling behind his ears. And a lot of the weird myths and stuff, which we can kind of get into a little bit, can kind of be drawn directly back to this and what it did here. But just on the surface level, it made school really difficult for Pete. He couldn't hear. He was known to skip school pretty regularly. He would hide his books under the porch of his good friend John Rexius, who also would go on to play Major League Baseball and was from a pretty influential baseball family in the city. It also is going to impact another interesting area of Pete, his name. Pete is not Pete. His name is Louis Rogers. But he becomes Pete because he often couldn't hear when he was introduced to people and just called everybody Pete, old Pete, something like that. And the name just started getting thrown back on him. So it wasn't even his name, but it's going to kind of impact him there. And then from that, it's also going to kind of help develop his personality. Pete was known for this extremely loud, cocky, boisterous personality. And I think you have to have some of that inside of you to be that. But it appears Pete was actually pretty shy. And the loudness was a little bit of maybe some overcompensation because he couldn't hear. You know, it obviously makes sense. If you can't hear somebody, you're going to speak louder in hopes that they do as well. But the cocky side of it comes a little bit because he couldn't hear in conversation, he was often known to turn that conversation back on the one thing he knew best. And the one thing we all know best is ourselves. You know, so somebody comes up to Pete and says, weather's looking great today. And Pete goes, I'm the best batter of the American Association, because that's what he knows best. I have no idea what that guy said. So those things are really going to kind of become dictated by his health issues. And then again, other things that, you know, that's going to impact his playing, you know, in the field, at bat. Who he is kind of going to be dictated by that. And we'll talk about that in a minute if you want. But then the other level of Pete is he discovers drinking pretty young. And that too kind of becomes a defining factor of who Pete was. He discovers drinking as a young man. And as was most things with Pete, it seems to be tied to baseball. The stories that are kind of told, and, you know, like with all stories of Pete, you got to kind of wade through some of the myth to get to the truth. The two stories there, and I think we can find the truth somewhere, is one story that's often told is Pete as a young man was playing in a game, and they put a keg of beer out at third base, and every time you got to third, you were entitled to a glass of beer there, and Pete thought, I'm going to get to third as much as possible. So that's one story. The other story, which probably seems a little more likely, sorry, the army of 4-year-olds is saying hello. The other story is he was pitching early in Pete's career. He was a pitcher, so as a young teenager, he was playing a game against some grown men, and he was dominating them. So to kind of help even the playing field, the other team was known to give him beer in between innings in hopes that it would ruin his pitching a little bit. Whatever it was, it seems that Pete took a real liking to the drinking of it. And it seems to solve a number of issues for him. One, it's going to kind of help him in some of these social settings. You know, it's going to give him that a little bit of liquid courage. But on the other side, for somebody who's suffering from these kind of really like severe pains in his head and problems, it's going to kind of help ease the pain. And I think Pete really discovered that it wasn't love, right? It wasn't money, but it was definitely the whiskey that eased the pain. And if somebody's sitting there going, did this dude just drop a Darryl Scott reference? I did, because it's a great song. If you don't know it, go listen to The Whiskey Eases the Pain by Darryl Scott. But I truly, like, for Pete, the whiskey was what eased the pain for him. And then it's going to become kind of become one of the overriding kind of, you know, personality traits of him, is this drinking and all these stories of that.
He was basically self-medicating, I guess, in modern terms, that what you'd call it, Ben.
100%. And I think that's another thing that's really interesting about Pete is a lot of who he is with alcohol and stuff like that. I mean, it can be said for a lot of people at the time. We just didn't have an understanding of addiction and alcoholism at the time. Later in his life, he's going to be institutionalized, but it doesn't seem he had any real mental issue that he had besides being depressed and going through some physical issues there. But again, because of a lack of understanding about kind of alcoholism and addiction, you know, it was easier to kind of institutionalize him there.
The team, the Louisville team that he played for, especially the first, I'll say 5 years. Who was the manager? Jim Hart.
Yeah, they had a number in there. Yes, they had a bunch of different managers. But
they were very. I mean, they tolerated this. Do you think that if he had played for another team that was tough on him right from the beginning, his career and his life might have gone in a different direction? I mean, they seem to have tolerated a lot of things because he was the draw, he was the #1 player, and they overlooked a lot of things.
I mean, I don't think he was the only player in baseball at the time who was drinking, and I think a lot of teams struggled with when their best player was also their, you know, biggest drinker as well. They definitely tolerated a lot. And the interesting thing is, you know, it's not possible to say that it didn't impact his game, but even with his drinking and known instances where he was playing drunk, his numbers were still heads and tails above everybody else. So it's kind of hard to really criticize somebody when they are far and away your best player. There's some instances early on in his career where he, has a really bad game performance that's directly tied to drinking, but it doesn't really seem to start impacting towards later in his career. And he ends up getting fairly sober, if not completely sober. It's not clear how sober he was after the 1889 season. So he kind of gets sober then. That's towards the tail end of his career when some of his health issues really start dominating. But it's an interesting thing, like how much better could he have been? And they did tolerate that. He wasn't the only drinker on his team. There was quite a few. I mean, Toad Ramsey was another one whose career is, really high peaks, but really low lows. He's got a couple of great years now, but he's got some really awful years. And he was another one who just, couldn't get it together and stuff like that. But Louisville seems to tolerate quite a bit of that. And for Pete, he, for a while, had some friends that he grew up with who were in ownership, which helps. It's going to help when you kind of have somebody there who's going to look out for their friend and kind of overlook some of their problems.
Louisville, wasn't it it was sort of the town's semi-pro team for like 4 or 5 years before they joined the American Association, right?
Yeah. So Pete starts playing. I'm sorry, was there another question there?
No, I'm just saying the rules were a little looser with the semi-pro clubs. So.
Oh yeah, Pete plays for the Eclipse, which was a local team in town, and they did have a major league team. They had the Grays in 1876 and 1877. But kind of after the gambling scandal, the team goes away. The Eclipse established itself as not only the best kind of semi-pro team in the city, but as one of the better semi-pro teams in the country. So they're playing some of these other teams, Akron and stuff like that. The Eclipse was interesting because they were mostly homegrown, where some of these other semi-pro teams seemed to bring other players in, whereas the Eclipse was mostly just homegrown players. Pete himself off that team quickly establishes himself as one of the better players, and he would have been a teenager at the time. A lot of the team was built among him and some of his friends he grew up with in the west end of town. And a number of those guys go on to play Major League Baseball and have different degrees of success. Fred Pfeffer has a pretty great career as a second baseman. Chicken Wolf wins a batting title in 1890 in the American Association. A lot of them were kind of role players, but a number of those guys from that team and who he played with kind of end up going to the Major League as well. The team itself, after the Grays fold, kind of becomes the main team in Louisville. And then in 1882, when the American Association forms, they pretty much are just going to take that team and turn it into their major league team with the addition of a few other players within there. And that's kind of how he ends up there. And there's a lot of interesting stuff with what would have happened if he would have ended up in another city at the time. If he would have went somewhere else, if they didn't form this team, he would have ended up in the NL, and that changed the whole Hall of Fame outlook for him, I think. But the Eclipse itself is going to be one of the only teams that's going to last from the beginning of the American Association through the end before it's folded and goes and becomes, or all those players go to the Pittsburgh team.
The team itself, Pete loved that town. It seemed like Louisville, and that's why he stayed with that team. But towards the end there, it seemed he did a 180 on Louisville, where he held a grudge against them after the 1889 was the 89 season, where he didn't have a kind word to say at all about the team. What happened there?
So, well, I think yes, Pete loved his town, but the other thing too is Pete, despite this loud persona, was pretty insecure, and I don't think he truly ever really wanted to go elsewhere. He had opportunities from the start of his career. I mean, with his talent, with his skills, he was obviously going to be in demand. But I don't think he really wanted to go. He felt much more comfortable at home. He lived with his mom his entire life, which to me right there says a lot. Oftentimes, the situations he seemed to gravitate to in baseball involved somebody he knew or had a pre-existing relationship with. So I don't think it's just solely that he was like, I just want to be at home. He did, but I think there was reasons why. Even when he did leave after the 1889 season, he often seemed to go to places that he had a little bit of a connection with somebody there. The 1889 season was just a disaster in itself. And the real falling out point is money. And it's interesting because Pete himself seems to have always, his family wasn't, I wouldn't say was rich, but fairly wealthy, maybe upper middle class, and always maintained that. Pete himself seems to have always done fairly well with his money, but it always was a problem. It was almost like a respect thing. Like, they're not paying me, they owe me this. So that was never an issue, but he felt that there was money they owed. They also started fining him a lot. And a lot of it was stuff he felt was unfair. He was mad one time, he threw his bat in the river. and they find him. And he's like, it's my bat. I can do what I want with it. And they find him over that. So things like that, he really took offense with. And he leaves after the 1889 season. But even then, he comes back for a bit. And I think he would have come back again if they would have had him back. But it didn't seem like they maybe wanted to deal with, not even at that point he was sober, but the who Pete was, the image of Pete, and deal with kind of all of that came kind of with it. But he, when he leaves, he goes and plays in Cleveland and Cincinnati, and so he's still fairly kind of in that general area. He didn't like to leave home a whole lot.
Is there would it be fair to say that he was obsessed with hitting in a way like just from hitting, to compare the two players? Nothing about his personality or any of his habits, but his hitting. Was he as obsessed with hitting as, say, Ted Williams was?
Yeah, I think it's really fair to say. I think that's becomes one of the things that is overlooked with all the other eccentric, odd things about Pete. Is Pete really thought about hitting? Now, again, it obviously wasn't the art of hitting and as well thought out science wise and numbers wise and stuff that we have now. But he thought about it. I mean, he on one level thought about the bat that we used. I mean, at the time, players weren't putting as much care or thought into that, and he thought, well, it's important. I mean, this is kind of the most important thing when you go up to the plate. Like, this is what you're doing to do that. So he thought about that, and he thought about different things. He approached hitting in a little different manner. I mean, he was a power hitter on one level. He was known to hit, really long kind of hits at the time when there was maybe more controlled hitting. Home runs were different, but he hit hard, and he believed that you can just hit balls hard and fast. And he was known to talk about how like third basemen were scared when he got to the plate because he was just going to rip one down there. But he really did think about hitting, and it's interesting because a lot of the funny stories can be directed to there. He has a lot of weird things he does with his eyes. He was known to pour buttermilk into them. He was known to smoke cigarettes, and when he exhaled the smoke, he wanted it to go in his eyes. When it was raining, he would walk and look up and hope the rain would pour in his eyes. And he would do all these things like that. And it sounds like, just the stuff that an odd, crazy drunk man may do. But if we pause and we think about it, well, why is he doing that? Well, one, your eyes are about the most important thing you have as a hitter, right? You've got a finite moment to determine that ball coming in. So he wants to take care of his eyes. But then the other side of it is he has this serious health issue that's causing him pain in his eyes and stuff like that. And he's a man of limited education in an era of questionable medical practices. So he's trying to not just self-medicate with alcohol, but here, the buttermilk in my eyes, it soothes them. It's making me feel better. Now, the funny thing is I talked to an eye doctor about that, and he was like, he would have been better drinking the buttermilk because of the nutrients in it would have done more for him. Pouring the buttermilk in his eyes, there's bacteria that could have harmed him. But for him, it was that instant relief. So he really did think about hitting there. The other thing that's interesting, and it sounds like an odd quirk, but it really serves a purpose, is Pete believes all bats have a predetermined number of hits. Well, if you think about that, that's a really convenient way to never, ever doubt yourself and put blame on yourself. If I don't get a hit, it's not my fault. That bat ran out of hits. So I'm going to get rid of that one, and I'm going to get another one with more hits, and I can just move on with my day. So it's an interesting thing. And, that may have not been this conscious decision, but unconsciously, it really is going to help you hitting wise, to separate yourself that it's not me. I'm doing the right thing. I'm still stepping up here and doing A, B, and C. So Pete really did think about hitting in this way. And, people often talk about, his talent and this and that, but there's plenty of stories about how hard he worked. He would get up in the morning before games and go out to the field by himself. And he was known when they were on the road to go and hit by himself. So he actually still put the work in for that.
The title of the book, the original Louisville Slugger, his tie-in with the bat and the bat company. In the book, you offer a couple of different scenarios of who requested the first custom-made bat and who actually made the first custom-made bat, whether it was the father or the son. In your opinion, based on your research, what's the true story, or closest to being the true story?
So the whole story, right? The myth of Pete is in 1884, he was in a bit of a slump. He broke his bat. Bud Hillerick, who was the son of J.F. Hillerick, who owned a local woodworking company, approached him and said, I can make you a bat. The Hillerick company at the time was not making bats professionally. Bud was likely making some for himself. He played amateur baseball in the area, but his father seemed to be opposed to baseball because of the drinking and gambling associated. So the story is, under the cover of night, Bud and Pete go into the workshop. And as Pete stands over Bud's shoulder, he gives him specific directions on how he wants his bat turned and made. And he picks it up every now and then and swings it. The next day he goes out and has 4 hits. And that's the legend of it. it's questioned because in 1884 there is no documentation of this event happening, which to me is more proof that it did happen. First off, why would a teenage son going against the wishes of his father wish to broadcast that he is doing something he didn't want? But the other side of it is, everybody questions, well, how come Pete, didn't really like say anything at the time? Well, he got a bat turned by a local company that was making chair rails chair legs and stair rails and butter churns. So it wouldn't have made sense. But what there is over time is throughout the rest of the 1800s, there was a lot of references to him getting bats turned by a Louisville company, a Louisville firm. And it's often unnamed, but I think it's an easy connection to make there. So that's the myth there. What I believe is the story, and what happens is there's just no one moment where Pete goes, oh, I had this bat made. But what does start happening is we see these references to him getting bats made by a company back in Louisville and custom made bats. He's getting a special bat and it's going to be this. And he would often talk about that. And he shared those bats around. Well, we see the Hillard Company go from making, butter churns and chair legs to all of a sudden they start making bats in the early 1890s. And at first they were called Falls City Sluggers, but then they changed it to the Louisville Slugger. And it was a nickname that had been associated with Pete. So the connection gets made there. Where the confusion comes in is because there's no one kind of documented, letter or whatever that says Pete had it done. Over time, other players tell this story of getting it back. And most famously, Arlie Latham, who in the 1930s gives an interview and basically gives the exact same story that Pete did. Now, a bit of a side note, which is an interesting kind of possibility, is Pete and Arlie were teammates. They seem to have a contentious relationship, and it may have been a way of Arlie kind of getting back at his long dead teammate. It may have also just been typical Arlie Latham, who was kind of known as being kind of a prankster and loudmouth and jokester. So it could have just been him taking there. Bud himself admitted that Arlie had a bat turned by him, but always said Pete was the first. Through the early half of the 20th century, there's a number of articles that more specifically referenced Pete's role in there. The confusion as to who made the bat, whether it was Bud or his father or even an unnamed kind of worker, is definitely left to confusion. The story is always Bud because I think it makes it a lot more interesting to be going against your father's wishes and he played baseball. But in his obituary, it says that JF did it and he seemed to take credit for it. So there's confusion there. What do I think out of all of that is Pete had a bat made at the company? I think most likely Bud was involved. Why? He was playing baseball. He was making bats. I don't think it's the legendary scenario where Bud approaches his hero and says, I can make you a bat. I think Pete and Bud knew each other. They would have played in the area. Pete was a very, friendly, outgoing person because he was loud and probably knew Bud, probably knew that was a place to get bats made. It wouldn't have been the first bat they made, but it would have been the first kind of custom made bat to those specifications. And then more importantly, Pete helps spreading the word of that. So I think that's the story there, is that Pete popularizes kind of what this company can do, that they can make bats as you want. And Pete was going out and sharing it with other teammates. And then, Hillard Company at the time realizes we have a much better, money-making avenue here than butter churns to start making bats. And to me, that's the story there. And the Hillard Company throughout the early 20th century, there's a number of articles and references to Pete. They themselves talk about the legend of it, which I think is a much better way for them to approach it because it helps keep it mysterious. But there was, in the 1920s, there was some baseball dignitaries visiting the museum, and they talk about Pete getting the first custom-made bat there. And they pretty explicitly say that there. So to me, Pete had the first custom-made bat there. It probably isn't the legendary story where he goes out after a slump and has 4 hits, because even just on an interesting level, I went through and said, let's find these patterns. Can we find a slump followed by this number of hits? And it doesn't match up like that. So he probably had a bat made there. He probably really liked it. He probably talked about it. And Pete was known to share those bats, and it helped spread the word of the company there.
Does anybody else have a question for Tim? I mean, I don't want to monopolize this thing.
I have one.
Yeah, go ahead.
One of my interests is how ball player alcoholism was treated over the years. And
Yep.
One of the things that's interesting is that how alcoholism went socially from being believed to be a moral failing to being a medical condition over time, but it really started to hit its stride in the 30s. But sports writing didn't really catch up to that until probably the last 50 years or so. Sports writers tended to cast these stories as, oh, what a goofball, or oh, what a, rather than seeing the medical aspect of it. And I'm curious about whether there was that the research I did on this had to do with Bugs Raymond, who comes along about 25 years later. But curious about the stories that people were telling about Pete, whether they dealt with the moral failing or whether I didn't get the sense from your book that they really understood the mastoiditis or the other medical issues that were involved.
No, and if you don't mind, I'll talk about both of those. I think that's completely it, is they didn't understand, one, the alcoholism in itself and the drinking and the issues there, and two, they didn't understand the health issues. So most of the stories of him just talked about him, being a drunk. And a good example of that is there's kind of a famous story of Pete after a game was going to go out, and he had been drinking, and he was going to go out front. He had his fishing pole, and he sat out front of the hotel, and he started fishing in the gutter because it had been raining, because he was going to catch his dinner. It's a funny story, right? This guy having a drink, and he's drunk, sitting out front, smoking a cigar, fishing in the gutter. But that's not the story there, right? Because that's a funny story to tell. Oh, look how funny Pete is. But that's not what happened, really. And you can find some of these instances where they'll have the truth buried in another story, but this funnier story is the one we remember. What seems to really have happened there is Pete was going to go fishing, and he was drunk, and he passed out on the sidewalk somewhere and had to be carried back to the hotel with all his fishing gear. Well, that to me speaks to that sad side of it, this alcoholism, this issue that's really dominating him. And the other kind of story that I think is interesting is the most famous quote attributed to Pete is, "I can't hit till I hit the bottle." And it almost sounds like, I'm going to take my drink, I'm going to power up, and I'm going to go out here and hit. But that's not what he said, actually. What actually happened was in 1888, he had signed a temperance pledge and wasn't drinking, and his hitting was suffering. And he said to someone, "I think I need to hit the bottle so I can hit again." So he was associating that he had a drink, that his hitting power, this natural talent he had, or that he worked at, came from his drinking. And to me, that really speaks to the sad side of the alcoholism, that's how he associated, and nobody could be like, "Pete, that's not the problem." But that's really what he said. But we, again, take the funnier side, like, let me get my drink, now let me step up to the plate. So I think that was really misunderstood, and it's much easier to just talk about the drunk and the negative sides of it there without understanding it. The understanding of it as mastoiditis, I think, is really misunderstood, and nobody understood the amount of pain he was in, but then how it impacted him as a player. Some of the stuff he did that he's known for in the field, like his fielding, I think, is greatly impacted by his mastoiditis. And one of the knocks on Pete is always he's this horrendous fielder. Now, he wasn't Ozzie Smith, but the numbers don't lend it out that he was as horrible as they want to believe. He was generally average. And early in his career, he was playing second base and shortstop. You don't put your worst defensive player there. The reason he moved from second short wasn't because of what was happening necessarily with his fielding, but so he was known to stand on one foot with his knee kind of up in the air. Oh, this sounds hysterical. Look at silly Pete Browning. But the reason he was doing that is he had been run over a couple times, and he couldn't hear base runners approaching because he was mostly deaf. So it was a defense mechanism to hope to deter them. Well, then what he started doing is he started moving further and further and further back in the infield. Well, again, that's not exactly kind of great for your defensive skills. So eventually they move him into the outfield. Well, he still continues to stand on one foot at times. Why? Because now he's got teammates running on fly balls, and he can't hear them, whether they're calling him off or calling for the ball, and he doesn't want to get ran over. So then what he starts doing is he just stops running. But again, being Pete, he can't just go, "Oh, you know what? I can't hear." He goes, "Well, look, I could run, but I'll wear myself out. And if I'm worn out, I'm not going to hit as well. So how about those young fellows over there? They go get the ball, and I'm just going to stand right here." So again, it's misunderstood, and it seems like it's lazy Pete. And yes, there's an aspect of that. There's another story later in his career where he starts stopping balls with his feet. Oh, silly drunk Pete using his feet. He suffers from vertigo. If you're dizzy and you bend over to pick up a ball, it probably is going to make that worse. But again, that wasn't understood. He was known that when he played, there was a field that had a tree, and it cast a big shadow over the field in the corner. And he would stand back in the shadow because he always talked about the heat really impacting his head and how much it hurt. And he was often told, let's move up. And he was like, again, I can, but he's like, then I'm probably not going to feel good. I can't hit as well. So I'm going to stand back here over in the shade. So there's all these stories, but if you pause and think about that, you can really understand how that health condition impacted him, but there was no understanding of that. Just kind of like the alcoholism, we didn't really understand how it was impacting him and what it was. And I think Pete also struggled to go back to the alcohol. He knew the image of himself. He often talked when he got sober in 1890, or mostly sober as it seems. He was really worried about going out in public, but he knew he liked to go out. He was boisterous and was known to be at the bar and tell stories, but he was worried that somebody was going to give him a drink. He was worried that somebody, he said, was going to spike his lemonade. So he had a level of understanding that, like, this is a worry, and people had this image of me. So to me, the misunderstanding of that is really all the story of Pete. I mean, the part of my idea in this book was there's the legend of Pete, but then how can we find the truth in the myth there? And that's really what I wanted to do is, well, what seems to be the real truth about it? Who was he as a man and a person and a ball player, not this legend that was drunk and standing on one foot in the field? Why was he doing that? And I think all that misunderstanding of Pete is really defines who he is.
I love the way you did that in the book too, about saying, here's the legend, here's what probably the story was.
Yeah. Thank you. And that was a big point. And again, I think that's the one thing. His legacy is always going to be complicated because we don't have Pete to go, hey, this is true. We are going to be able to read and understand and make these, assumptions and guesses and things that we've seen written and that he may have said or mentioned and stuff like that. But his legacy is always complicated because of that. We still have just these numbers or just this outcome, and we never will always, completely get to wade through and see all of those. I mean, on one hand, you look at his numbers and he's this great player, and on the other hand, he has all these negative things that that people want to hold up against him. So he becomes this really interesting character, I think, with so many layers to dig into and read about and understand.
I think I trash sports writers a lot, or at least the type who are into the telling a good story rather than getting the facts right. And I think what your book really illustrates is that if you get the facts right, you end up with a more interesting story
100%,
than just the look at Goofy Pete.
And that's exactly it. Is they didn't, we didn't need to create this myth of Pete, and we didn't do it intentionally. It's how all myths and folk tales kind of happen. We tell a story, and then it gets repeated over time, and it becomes truth. But I agree, like that was part of when I almost said, like, swing back to the first thing you asked was what interested me about Pete was this myth, but who was he, and all this other stuff that was here. Wow, what was the truth behind it? And there's this interesting guy it's a tragic story of Pete. I mean, he's battling with this severe health issue and playing baseball at a very high level, and he's an alcoholic. I mean, to me, that tragic story is enough. We don't have to make him anything he's not, but we do. So let's wade through there and find out who he really is, and it can be more interesting.
Right.
Karen, you have a question?
To know what would you think of, what would be the legacy for him?
And that's always the tough question, right? So I think for Pete,
Okay.
I think, and it's it's a great question. I think for Pete's legacy, one, you have to talk about not just his connection to Louisville Slugger, because that's obviously the first thing we're going to mention there, but the fact that he put the thought into this idea that bats are important, because that wasn't a thought at the time. Now, did he completely change everybody's mind? No, but he was sharing these bats out, and he starts with that. I think how good he was as a player at the time needs to be recognized. He won 3 batting titles in 2 leagues. He was literally a whisker away from winning 4 batting titles in 3 leagues, which would be an impossibility now. But, stuff like that. Over the first 10 years of his career, he is in the top 3 9 times. He has three batting titles, 3 second-place finishes. So, I mean, he has a run in consistency that is pretty impressive. But then the interesting thing is it helps. His legacy is also, the what if, and the idea that he played in the American Association, and there's just this already kind of like, preconceived notion that was a lesser league, which doesn't entirely seem to be true. Teams players move back and forth and finish generally in the same place or had the same number of wins. But because we have already determined that the American Association was a lesser league, then it always makes us question, was Pete this good? How good was he? But yet in 1890, when he plays in the Players League, which is all or most of the best players, Pete wins a batting title. In 1891, he almost won a batting title in the NL, a broken wrist at the end of the season. He was getting hot. He could have come out and won a batting title there too. So he did play well there, and he stayed in the American Association, not because he couldn't play elsewhere, because he wanted to be in Louisville. So his legacy is long and complicated. On one level, he should be recognized as one of the best players of the 19th century. And I think we as fans and baseball people often can look at numbers and find what we want to say. Oh, this number tells us he wasn't good or he wasn't. But somebody told me something that I think is just the best way to look at it. What did our eyes tell us? Now, none of us, I don't know how old you guys are, but I don't think any of us saw Pete play in the 19th century. I'm not judging you guys. I don't know how old you guys are. Right? I got a lot of hair and no hair here. So, I'm in that club as well. But none of us saw him. But people at the time, they said he was one of the best. Why do we want to doubt what those people said? Other players said that he was one of the best. Why are we going to doubt those who saw them? And we unfortunately don't have YouTube games that we can go watch of him or any of that kind of stuff. But it's almost like we want to doubt what people believed at the time because, his WAR number, when you factor in that the sun was coming up over here and doing this, doesn't quite match up to this player, so he's probably not as good. But at the time, people just said he was the best or one of the best. And so I think that's his legacy, is maybe who he was, but then maybe giving a new understanding on how we look at some of these other players from that era. Because there's a lot of players in the 19th century that we could reevaluate and think about in a different way. But because it's so long ago and we are only basing it on the myth of the legend like Pete, we don't really know. So I think that kind of can be his legacy there.
Okay, thank you.
Tim, you mentioned about the American Association being viewed as a inferior league by some people. Going back 50, 60 years ago, would that be one of the reasons why maybe Pete wasn't considered for the Hall of Fame? I don't know if he would have been voted on by a veterans committee or whatever, but was that held against him? And a second part to that question, being that Pete's so far back in the history of baseball, are his chances nil today of being ever considered for the Hall of Fame?
Yeah, so I think the American Association is a big part of it because when they first started getting guys, they started the Hall of Fame, there was already just this kind of, the American Association was a lesser league, and baseball scholarship, as we all know it now, didn't really exist, and we weren't analyzing and looking, able to say that this player and that player were similar and stuff. So I think there was already that. I think it took a long time to get an understanding that it wasn't a different league. I think that he, the interesting too is he's never had a vote cast for him, which is even interesting. You know what I mean? He's been on the ballot before, but I think it's interesting. He's never even had somebody who goes, oh yeah, this guy. I think we are so far removed from 19th century baseball that it's really hard to get understanding of who those players are. And look, there are people, and many of you guys are probably those people way above my pay grade who can speak on people getting in the Hall of Fame or not getting in the Hall of Fame. And if you think about it, he's getting lumped in with players pre-1980 now. I mean, people voting now are going to go, oh, 1960s and 70s, but 1880, I have no connection there. So we already have players that are more in our memory banks that we're trying to deal with. So I think it's really tough. I mean, my opinion, and it counts for nothing, is I think they should take one last swing at the 19th century and just say, let's just go through, see who we may have missed for whatever reason, and be done with it. And then we can close the book on 19th century Hall of Fame discussion. I mean, or keep it open because it's fun to talk about and we can do this. But I think do I think he's ever going to get in? Probably not. I just think that it's so far removed. It's hard for people to go back and start reevaluating that when we have so many other players and so many other, people to look at and deal with and whatever, that it's going to be hard.
Scott, do you have anything?
Yeah, Tim, I have a question about his end of his career.
Sure.
Looks like 1893, he hit 355 for Louisville. Pretty good season, but then it kind of tails off. And I think you commented a little bit in the book about he had a trouble finding a team and getting, extend his career a little bit. That's a pretty good year. He's only 32 years old. So what would happen after that point?
So that's just that he doesn't really have this complete falling off. It does seem that teams didn't want to give him a chance, maybe because of who he still was, even though he was generally seemed to be sober and some of those issues are behind him. I think part of it was if his hometown team in Louisville didn't want to take a chance on him, other teams were then we probably don't either. It seems he still wanted to play in 1894. He makes a couple of appearances with the two different teams when they were in Louisville, but it just seems nobody really wanted to give him a chance. He plays kind of some other kind of semi-pro ball for a little bit after that, but he can't get an opportunity. I think it's more just nobody wanted to deal with the perception and legend of Pete, even if that really wasn't who he was at that time or even always. And that kind of impacts him too, right? He kind of has a bit of a shorter career. He does later on say that, hey, does anybody want me to be a professional hitter, basically kind of like a DH, and just I can be on your team, and if you need somebody to come up and take a hit, I can do that. Nobody takes him up on that offer there. but that'd be an interesting what if. So yeah, there's no real good reason why teams don't sign him. It just seems they didn't want to deal with the legend of Pete, and if his hometown team wouldn't, want to sign him, then why would he go elsewhere? And there's always also too, how much was Pete trying to go elsewhere? Because as I said, he struggled to leave kind of his safety net at home and get too far away. So it also seems, how much effort was he also putting in? What he did want to become was an umpire. But I think, again, the image of Pete kind of kept him from being that after he stopped playing. And I always hesitate to say retire because he didn't really retire. He just never had any other opportunities. He wanted to be an umpire. And the ironic thing was he was always recognized for being very honest on the field. And so he may have been a good umpire, but because he was Pete Browning, it doesn't seem that they were willing to give him that opportunity. He did, umpire a few games at home, but never anything like regular season. He did some exhibition games, but it just seems he could never kind of break into that as well.
He owned a bar too in Louisville, so I guess in his mind he had a fallback. If his career was winding down, he could devote himself to that business. It was not a good choice for a business for that guy.
Yeah, no, and he owned it, but it wasn't like this lengthy thing he did. He actually owned a couple of different things throughout his career and would try and do stuff. He ran for city delegate a couple times. He actually worked as a cigar salesman. It never seemed he found one thing after baseball that was really his thing. And I think the problem is he's so identified with baseball, and that was who he was. He had no other real skills. And again, he just couldn't really get in. He didn't have the ability to help, be involved in a team or any of that kind of stuff. You couldn't umpire, you couldn't get back. So while he had these other things he did, they never really lasted. But money never seemed to be much of an issue. His family seemed to have always kind of maintained a level of wealth. And he seemed to have always been pretty good with his money, despite complaining about not being respected for it. It never seems to be something where it was like he was destitute at the end of his life. So he always kind of had money and could kind of do his thing. But yeah, he really struggled after baseball to find his identity of who he was.
Right.
Does anybody else have any questions about Pete? Because I have a question for Tim if he has a few minutes.
I have all day.
RJ is our resident White Sox fan, and I know you contributed to Bill Nolan's book, The One-Win Wonders, about the was it Tom Doherty or Doherty, however you pronounce his name?
Yep.
Tim, RJ, are you familiar with this player?
I am not.
Okay, well, we want to take a couple minutes and maybe tell us about Tom and his one major league game and his one win as a pitcher.
Yeah, so I came across him for the One-Win Wonders book. He literally has one win, but he also only has one appearance. So he basically went out. He had one 2-inning appearance. He pitched a couple perfect innings, gets the win, and that's it. And it's interesting because there's no real good reason why he only had that. He was thought of as a fairly good player, but just could never kind of break through. He was on the roster, but could never kind of do anything. And then after this, he seems to kind of get shuffled around. He ends up in Milwaukee and just kind of plays there the rest of his career, but he never could break back innings. Just kind of an interesting story that this guy who also moved around the infield a bunch, he kind of played a lot of positions and all of a sudden discovered that he could pitch, and that was how he ended up kind of breaking into the majors there. But he just has this one appearance, one couple of inning win that he gets, and then he's gone. So he's kind of unique figure there. There's lots of guys who only have one win, but they had 10 starts or 15 starts. I mean, he's 1-0, one appearance. That's it. I mean, it's kind of a perfect story on some level for that.
And this was in 1904. Is that correct?
Yep. Yeah, so he's a unique guy, So
I'll have to look that up.
There's the chapter in the One-Win Wonders book. He's an interesting guy, not as interesting as Pete, but an interesting guy himself.
Well, if nobody else has any more questions, Tim, tell us what irons you have in the fire. What's going on? Any new books on the horizon? Anybody that interests you you might want to write about in the future?
It's funny. I don't know. It sort of feels like I might be going back and writing about music again. I loved diving into baseball, and I really love 19th century baseball. So I kind of always have my eye open if there's another player that I feel would kind of capture me. And I may write about, and this may be completely something that nobody is into, but early 21st century Baltimore music scene was recognized as this super influential music scene. Rolling Stone named it the best rock scene in the country for a while. I'm from Baltimore, and I was lucky enough to kind of be part of that scene. I was writing for some magazines about it, so I kind of want to do that. And it's still a scene that has like a lasting impact today, so it kind of fits in that theme that I talked about. These kind of overlooked scenes that don't get the respect or recognition. So it's kind of a departure from 19th century baseball, but some people are like, well, 19th century baseball was a departure from bluegrass. So I'm kind of all over the place in my interests. But I really enjoyed the journey in 19th century baseball, and I would love to kind of get back in there if I found the right player to kind of write about. And Pete, to me, was really great because he struck on all those things I like, and he had a neat story, and enough people knew about him but didn't know about him. So I'd love to, another player jumps across there like that again. I'd really love to do it, and I also love just baseball and the SABR community and getting to talk. Like, I mean, one thing I've loved is how many different chapters and groups just love to talk baseball and get together on like Saturday mornings like this and do this. I think it's such a great thing we have here with SABR.
Well, I know you're going to be up in Cooperstown at the Fred.
Yep.
And in a couple of weeks, I think you're going to be on with Peter Mancuso and Bill Bailey. I think when they do the 19th century, I think you're going to do review the book also with them. Is that correct?
Yeah, they're doing as part of their like a book club. I know they're going to do it. I won't be presenting at that, but then I think I have to look at my calendar. I think it's in May. I'll actually be presenting to the 19th century committee online, and then I'll be at the Fred. And I got some other chapter talks and be doing stuff like that. And there's kind of events here and there. I was at the Babe Ruth Museum last week, which was kind of fun in my hometown in Baltimore. So, if anybody's ever interested in coming out and seeing me talk, like follow me on socials. And, I always have stuff up on there. You can come hear me talk and, we sometimes mix some stuff in where there's some music and things like that. So we try and keep it fun.
Well, if anybody's up in Cooperstown, be sure, to attend the Fred, be sure to stop in, say hi to Tim. And Tim, we really appreciate you coming on today. As I said, I know we crossed wires a few times to make this happen, but I'm glad we finally got it together and enjoyed the book immensely. As I said, it was one of those books where you might have just walked by it uh, on a bookshelf and not given it a second look, but somebody recommended it for a read or for our club. And I think we had two books on the Casey finalist list that we've done this year. I think the other one was the Pete Rose book that we covered, but thoroughly enjoyable book, and I learned a lot about the American Association, especially, and Pete Browning was not on my radar, so I learned about Pete too.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for the kind words about the book. Like all those things you said was what I was hoping to get with this is, to introduce this overlooked guy, but also at the same time, 19th century baseball and just tell a good story. Like I like to tell people that I hope you could read the book, even if you're not a baseball fan. Like, I tried to not get too in the weeds in baseball stuff because I want people to be able to read it and enjoy who he is and understand who he is. But I also want baseball people to get some of that stuff they want to find in the weeds. So I tried to find that middle ground of a story and the deep knowledge that they want, but also the story that somebody else wants. So that's kind of the path I try to walk this. So I really appreciate the kind words about the book. It was a lot of fun to write and to research and to go down that whole of Pete's life. It was a really great journey.
And we also have to thank your wife for giving you the idea.
Yeah, yes.
Yes.
She, I'm waiting for her to nudge me on our next trip with an idea again. Since she's two of my three books, she kind of had the impetus for it. So.
Well, I'm going to stop the recording, but we're going to stay on. Peter, you're welcome to stay. We're going to just talk a little bit of baseball.